Welcome to the Rozanne On Demand CFPB video series, featuring Ontario System's Chief Compliance Officer, Rozanne Anderson. Widely recognized as a leading authority on collection-related compliance, Rozanne leads Ontario System's corporate efforts in response to the CFPB's launch of compliance examinations in the ARM industry. In this ongoing video series, Rozanne takes a deeper dive into the entire regulation, helping you make sense of the new rule and what it means for your agency. Before we get started, please take a moment to review our legal disclaimer. The information shared today is not legal advice. Please consult with your own independent legal counsel before making any business decisions regarding the use of this information.
Welcome to today's video podcast episode. Today we will focus our attention on 1006.14, section of the new rule for debt collection, Regulation F. This section of the regulation discusses what actually is harassing, oppressive, or abusive debt collection behavior. I think what most people have focused their attention on with regard to this provision are the call restrictions. This is the section of the new rule where the CFPB did respond to the industry's question, how many calls are too many? And the answer is, it depends. In this section of the new rule, the CFPB explains that a debt collector may attempt to call, if you will, a consumer no more than 7 times in a 7-day period per debt per person. So let's break that down. The rule states a debt collector may not attempt to communicate with any person more than 7 times in 7 days. So the first question anyone would have about this requirement, what is an attempt to call or an attempt to communicate? Well, first of all, the term is used very generally to mean that if you place a telephone call to a consumer, you have attempted to call them. If you place a call to any person, you have attempted to call that person. And this is probably a good time for me to underscore the fact when it comes to limiting call attempts, what the CFPB is trying to do is to limit those call attempts to a certain number per person per debt. Now, later on in our discussion, we will talk about how this may play out and how you may actually record the number of times you can attempt to communicate with a person. But for now, let's just think about it as an attempt to call is really when you place the call, launch the call, if you will. It includes leaving a voicemail message on the consumer or the person's voicemail message machine. In the context of a mobile phone, that would be leaving a pre-recorded voicemail on their mobile phone. The CFPB goes on to explain that a voicemail also includes a ringless voicemail. They draw no distinction between the fact that the attempt to call includes a voicemail, regardless of whether the phone rings or not. The second restriction the CFPB places on debt collectors with regard to calling practices has to do with the number of times a debt collector may have a conversation with a person per week per debt. Now, the challenge is the CFPB did not define what a conversation is, but we have every reason to believe that if the call connects and there is an exchange of voice one way or another, the debt collector must deem that to be a conversation. My personal opinion, which is not a legal opinion that you may rely upon, I suggest you ask your own outside counsel this question, but my personal opinion is as soon as the consumer has reason to believe this is a call from a debt collector, the conversation has taken place. I think if the person simply says hello, and then for whatever reason hangs up, it is possible that you could rebut the presumption, and we'll talk about that later, that actually was not that was not a conversation, because there was no information exchange whatsoever by the calling party, you. So let's review what the restriction is to be clear. A debt collector may not engage in more than one conversation with any person about a debt in a 7-day period. a 7 consecutive day period, which begins on the day of the actual conversation with the person. So if you and I have a conversation today, that would be day 1 of the 7-day period that maxes out my opportunity to have a conversation with you again about the debt. Now, there are certain exceptions to these general rules, but I think it's important for people to understand how these 7 and 7 rules differ and how to calculate the 7-day period. When it comes to calculating the number of attempts to call you make per week, that is a rolling 7-day period. So at no time may you ever exceed the seven attempts in 7-day rule. It differs just a bit when it comes to the call conversation restriction, because in that case, the actual conversation begins the 7-day period. Now let's talk about the exceptions to these general rules. The CFPB has recognized that there are times when a debt collector may exceed the 7 call attempts per week or the 1 conversation in 7 days per week restriction. And one of these exceptions has to do when the consumer actually provides you with the express consent to do so, to exceed the call limitation. And the way that will occur is if you are in a conversation with a particular person and they give you express permission to call them back at that about that debt, you may do so even if that trips the conversation to more than 1 per 7-day period beginning on the day you had the original conversation. However, the CFPB does make clear that once they give you that consent to call them back, that only applies for the 7-day period beginning with the day of their consent. So be very, very careful about how you record the consent to contact the consumer once you already have had a conversation, because you are limited to a 7-day period. The second exception that the CFPB affords debt collectors with regard to these call restrictions and call attempt restrictions has to do with the fact that if you never connect to the dialed number, if you receive like a triple tone response once you place the call, the CFPB is not going to impose the restriction on that incident. So if the call does not connect, they will not deem it to be an attempt to call. Now, some of you may have questions about what if somehow it creates a footprint? What if somehow when stir shaken goes into effect, I'm identified that it was a call from a debt collector? Those kinds of questions cannot be answered at this juncture. All we know today is if the call does not connect, it is not likely that some of those scenarios will even take place. My understanding is that with regard to stir shaken and the verification that will take place with regard to the calling party, that only happens when there's a connection made. And with regard to creating a footprint, that footprint only occurs when a connection is made. I encourage everyone to verify this with their call system provider so that you understand when a footprint is made and when a connection is established. The third restriction pertains to who you are actually calling. Everything I have talked about to this point is a restriction with regard to call attempts and call conversations and any person, a very, very broad term. It is not limited to a consumer, as that term is defined under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act and defined under Regulation F. The particular people that fall outside of the protection of these calling restrictions include the consumer's attorney. So apparently you can contact and attempt to contact the attorney with tremendous frequency. A consumer reporting agency. Calls into a consumer reporting agency with regard to the debt will not trip the call restriction requirements or the call conversation requirements. Obviously, the creditor. You can contact the creditor and discuss the debt, and that will not trip these restrictions. You also can call the creditor's attorney without worry that you need to calculate the number of call attempts or call conversations with the creditor's attorney or the debt collector's attorney. So these specific individuals or types of calls are specifically exempt from the call attempt restriction and the call conversation restriction per week. Thank you for watching this episode of Ontario Systems video podcast series. In our next video podcast, we are going to delve deeply into the presumption of compliance with these call restrictions and the presumption of non-compliance with the call restrictions. Thank you.
Thanks again for tuning into this week's episode of the Rozanne On Demand CFPB video series. As always, be sure to visit the Ontario Systems website for more exclusive events and information regarding the 2021 CFPB new rules.